You walk into a room full of world powers, suits, flags, the hum of quiet certainty. You represent a country barely 2 years old. No army to deploy, no economy to display, no seats that's truly yours. Just one thing in your arsenal, the words you choose next. That was Estonia in 1993, and that was Thomas Hendrik Ílfs. I'm Joe Khouly, and in this episode of The Diplomat, I sit down with a man who didn't just represent a new country. He had to explain it, frame it, defend it, sentence by sentence. He's a former president and the ambassador of his country. Because in a world where power is measured in weapons and GDP, Ílfs made the case for Estonia using nothing but clarity, conviction, and a refusal to be patronized. He challenged the labels. Post-Soviet? No. He said, we are a Nordic country that was occupied. That's not the same as being born behind the Iron Curtain, which is the divide between East and West after World War II. On one side, you had Western democracies. On the other, Soviet-controlled regimes. Living behind it meant your country, your freedom, your future, all dictated by Moscow. He warned about Russia when others still called it a partner. And he made NATO take cyber threats seriously before even cyber was seen as a warfare. And he helped build one of the world's most digitally advanced states, not by copying the powerful, but by outthinking them. In this conversation, you will hear what it means to speak for a country when the world sees you as too small to matter, how to warn of Russian aggression when no one wants to hear it, why cyber isn't just a tech issue, it's a sovereignty issue, and what today's diplomats still get wrong when they sugarcoat authoritarianism. Because power doesn't always announce itself with troops or tanks. Sometimes it walks into a room with no leverage at all and rewrites the rules just by telling its story right. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks, and this is a conversation you won't hear anywhere else. You arrived in Washington, D.C. as Estonia's ambassador in early 90s.
93, yeah.
Yeah, barely 2 years after independence.
1.5.
What was the hardest part of making a new country real to American leaders?
Everything. Well, first of all, I mean, we started out, despite U.S. foreign policy since 1940, the Stimson doctrine that the U.S. has not recognized the forcible annexation and incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. I got here, and we had been placed under Strobe Talbot in the Department of newly independent states, which had all of the former USSR together, and we're like, what do you mean? Having been recognized by the United States, having an embassy here and so forth. So that was one thing. I mean, just getting over this. I mean, what has been a bête noire for me for decades is former Soviet Republic, written by journalists from countries that are way less developed or more corrupt than my country. I mean, this is the things kind of, I mean, that's a larger issue that has to do with prejudices against Eastern Europeans. But I mean, when we are in a position where my country is one of the most digitally advanced in the world, and we have one of the lowest levels of corruption in the world, to have these journalists coming from countries which are far more corrupt. I mean, an American journalist, like, way behind Estonia when it comes to the Transparency International corruption list, or when it comes to digital matters. But that was the big problem then, because we were very poor and very backward, and that leads into the tech thing, which was that I'd been kind of geeky my whole life, and I learned to code in 1971, which was a long time ago. And so I was here, and it was, you're sitting here, and you're coming from a country that had at the time a GDP per capita of $2,800. Finland, which had a lower GDP per capita than Estonia in 1938, which was the last full year before the war, World War II, in 1993 had a GDP per capita of 2,400, or rather 24,000. So basically, Estonia was more than 8 times poorer than Finland. I mean, it was, and the GDP, I mean, it's not only GDP, it's like all the stuff we hadn't done because of Soviet occupation for 50 years. I mean, no, roads are terrible, communication is terrible, everything, just nothing works. And so, so I thought, well, is there anything where we can be on a level playing field with all of these countries that are very rich and doing well and advanced? And then a friend of mine who sent me an email in 93 saying, "Oh, you're one of those geeks. You should check this thing out." What it was the first web browser, Mosaic. Unlike today, when you just download it for free, I had to go to Radio Shack, and I think it cost $29.95, and I got 7 floppy disks, which I had to upload. And I proposed this to the Estonians, like, we ought to get like all the schools online. You teach kids how to code. And that was the beginning of what later on became a really big, full-fledged government effort to digitize the country. So that was that one thing. But on the other hand, I mean, we're still just, former Soviet Republic, Eastern Europe. I mean, there's a problem that we have until this day.
So did you find that Americans understood the threat Russia still posed, or was it just dismissed as Cold War paranoia?
It was just East European paranoia, ancient tribal hatreds. I mean, all this rhetoric of the early 90s.
So what was the choice of words that you have to convey to Americans to tell them about that threat?
Well, basically facts. Facts. I mean, what they are doing. I mean, it's not a...
What's one fact that you thought it will be conveyed? It will convey the message diplomatically and politically.
Well, I recall the State Department went ballistic after Yeltsin accused Estonia of shutting off water supplies to this city in Russia right across from an Estonian city. And I got, the State Department go, "What are you doing?" So, well, I'll check it out. And well, it turned out that the city of Ivangorod on the Russian side had not paid its water bill for 3 years. And, we had done all the right things, privatized the water company. I mean, privatized, much of all the state-owned stuff was now in private hands. So it was a private company. There was a water company provided water, and the Russians simply didn't pay, right? I mean, those are the kinds of facts that, but the problem was the State Department took this a priori position that, well, because Boris Yeltsin had complained, this must be true. Later on, I heard like President Clinton was like, "Boris lied to me." I mean, of course, the State Department also sent their diplomats to go, "Well, see what this Estonian ambassador said. Is it really true?" And they came back and said, "It's really true." So, I mean, facts are really the things you deal with. Language, I mean, I say more in terms of language, it's sometimes okay to be, well, it could be dangerous too, but to be better speaking English than your interlocutors.
And do you think facts in today's world of politics and diplomacy still matter or no?
They rarely matter. It's just sometimes they do, but you don't have much in the way of weapons when you're a small country that is, sort of former communist country, and sort of you can appeal to facts. They don't always work. I mean, that's I remember in 2007 when Estonia, which at that time already was one of the most digitally advanced countries in the world, and we got these massive cyber attacks. And so we went to NATO. I mean, they're so massive they shut down basically much of the operation of the country. So we went to NATO and said, I'm going to look what the Russians are doing. And then one very large country that I won't mention said, no, there's no proof of that. So, I mean, facts don't really always matter. I mean, if there's a political decision that we won't deal with that, then we don't.
And related to the diplomacy as survival and NATO, you warned early on about Russia's ambitions. What language were you hearing from Europe and the US that you knew was dangerously naive back then?
I mean, the common mantra was, well, you just have to talk to them. Actually, I remember this was kind of the sort of top of the top of my list of attitudes was when I came here as an ambassador and went to see the Finnish ambassador at the time. And, Finland always proud of its relationship with Russia. And so I sort of was taller than I am. And I'm pretty tall, but tall. He sort of came to put his arm around me and said, Thomas, we have so much experience with the Russians. And, the idea being that, we should talk to them. And I said, that's right, Jukka. We Estonians, we have no experience with the Russians, right? I mean, that kind of stuff is sort of shut down. But I mean, that was kind of this attitude. I mean, I had that a lot with some of the Western interlocutors who basically did not know Russia, did not understand the things they were doing, or they decided to ignore. And all you have then is like, well, you just have your facts. I mean, your positions, saying something, just saying, well, they're bad, they're this, that doesn't work. You need to say, this is what they did, this is what they did, this is what they're doing. And that's all you really have. I mean, let's face it, you're a small, at that time, not particularly wealthy country that used to be communist. So there are all kinds of prejudices that come in, and there are all kinds of attitudes. Ignorance is a big problem too. I mean, I think
to what? To politics or to diplomacy or?
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, it was just a year and a half ago when the Estonian Prime Minister at the time, Kaja Kallas, was one of the two serious contenders for being NATO Secretary General. And so then Franz Timmermans, who had been the vice president of the European Commission, said something to the effect, well, she's a very capable, smart woman, but we cannot allow a Secretary General of NATO be from a country that borders Russia. Now, if you think about it, like, wait a minute. The past 10 years, we have had a Secretary General from Norway, like, a country that borders Russia. I mean, so you see this, people come up with reasons either based on ignorance or simply, or just choosing to like find some kind of reason to not allow an Eastern European to have a position of authority. There are 5 positions in Europe which matter. I mean, political leadership positions. There's the President of the Commission, President of the Council, President of the Parliament, High Representative for Foreign Security, and the Secretary General. They're all 5-year terms. They're basically run together, even though NATO and EU are separate, but it's always a package. And between
you mean Secretary General for NATO?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. I mean, it's a separate organization, but they're just
in Europe. That's what
it all goes. Well, they all go with. I mean, they're not offset. I mean, they have the same, more or less the same. The same length of time and the same periods of when they start. So if you look at 2004, when you had the big enlargement of the EU and also many countries from NATO, 2004 to 2024, that's 4 terms of these 5 organizations. So there are 20 positions, right? 4 times 5, right? In that time, 1.5 positions were held by people from Central Eastern Europe. One was the president of the council, and for half a term, the president of the European Parliament, or the speaker of the parliament, out of 20 positions. I mean, that sort of says something about, the attitude. Kind of weird, I think, but I mean, it's getting better now, but but those are again, the facts that if you actually say them to people, they're like, oh, okay.
You just don't talk like a diplomat. You also, based on what you experienced in your life, you talk like the future. And while many leaders back then were still learning about emails, right? You were pushing Tiger Leap in schools. Can you give us like a summary of what was that? Why did you
Well,
choose
as I
to
mentioned
do this?
before, I mean, I realized in 1993 that the one place where we can compete is in tech.
So you decided to use technology as being part of diplomacy to push Estonia's forward in the world?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It was more in domestic. I mean, my argument was basically that I knew that domestically, sort of the teachers in the 40s and 50s, they would never like go along with. I mean, they would not be in favor, and 40, 50-year-olds would not like computers. What's that? But I knew that kids would would really take to it and just quickly learn everything, just as I had learned when I was a kid.
To be real, were you dismissed by those big nations back then as cute innovation from a small country?
Yes. What happened, though, what really sort of I think helped was in the private sector, we had 4, at the time, I would just call them kids. I mean, they were sort of people in their early 20s who were recent graduates of the technical university, and then they invented something called Skype. I mean, it was, the money came from the Swedes, and the Swedes say, well, that's our company. But in fact, all of the intellectual work it was invented by these 4 kids, right? 23 years old or something. And this became, in a month, became a worldwide sensation because suddenly you could call over the internet for free. I mean, it was the first voice over internet protocol, which now, I mean, all Zoom calls and FaceTime or whatever you have on sort of your phone, all that use the same technology that was invented back then. But suddenly you go like, well, we can't really dismiss these guys. I mean, they're actually pretty good. I mean, if they're coming up with this kind of stuff. And then you started getting articles about, how Estonia was doing stuff in technology and implementing technology in public services that no one else had ever done. And I mean, it just has been going ever since about 2001.
What language mistake do you think diplomats make today in dealing with authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, or even AI threats?
Language mistakes. Well, I think the problem is maybe sort of pre-linguistic, in that they don't know what they're talking about. So that you have to sort of understand what you're talking about in order to take positions on it, and that I found is often a problem. It's more that there are certain words that you don't want to use in diplomacy or in politics that apply to, say, my country, but you would say apply to the global South. I mean, the word colonialism. I mean, if you look at what happened to Eastern Europe under communism, that was pure colonialism. Now, if you say, well, basically the colonialist regime in Eastern Europe, how can you say that? Whereas, if you were to say the colonialist regime in Algeria was, oh yeah, obviously. But I mean, in terms of military occupation, in terms of, horrible violations of human rights, exploitation. I mean, all of this stuff happened in Eastern Europe, but it's just like we don't call that we don't, whatever what you want to call it. But
So if you had the chance to teach a course called Diplomatic Language for Dangerous Times, what would be lesson number 1?
Well, I think the main issue is that, I mean, avoid euphemisms. Because
Give me an example.
I mean, typical ones. Well, we had a frank exchange. Basically, that means we're yelling at each other, right? I mean, that's a frank exchange, right? But I mean,
Which means the language, lesson number one would be direct language, clear, direct language.
yeah, but I mean, you don't have to be insulting, but I mean, I think you ought to describe things as they are rather than couch them in.
And what is the danger of using, sugarcoating or euphemism? It could be interpreted different ways?
Well, it becomes ambiguous. I mean, this is.
And there's no room for ambiguity in diplomacy, you're saying.
Well, especially when we're talking about security. You can't really, I mean, we're talking about lives. Well, look, I mean, just saw the United States vote along with Belarus, North Korea, Cuba. I think Cuba was actually, didn't vote with them. But anyway, the United States voting here with Belarus, North Korea, other sort of similar regimes, vetoing a UN resolution condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine. You don't want the U.S. didn't want to use the word aggression. I mean, what do you call it when one country invades another one? I mean that's a pretty harsh example, but that shows that if you don't want to if you avoid language that is appropriate for the situation and try to sugarcoat it with some kind of namby-pamby expressions or even avoid discussing reality, and put it into altogether different terms, like, oh, well, we want this war to end, without saying who did what, and sort of excluding any kind of wording that would talk about who did what. I don't even know what you get out of that, aside from sort of being ridiculed, I think.
And in your early diplomatic battles for Estonia's survival, if you could say, was there a word or a phrase that you crafted or thought about or said, and you knew if we say it right, the world might actually hear us?
Well, I think one of my big one of the issues I face is, how do you describe what Estonia is? And so I sort of came up with this idea that, well, actually, what Estonia is the only post-communist Nordic country that, had we not been occupied, we would be just like our northern Nordic neighbor, Finland. I mean, we're culturally very close to each other. I mean, linguistically, we're like sort of Spanish and Portuguese, German or Dutch, that close. Culturally, historically, in order to get that across, instead of being just sort of what's the difference, it's like, oh, you're just like Uzbekistan. No, we're not. We're more, we're like Finland and Sweden, but it's just that we happen to have been occupied by the Soviets. That was the difference. I think also, there's a lot of dancing around the term Russian versus Soviet. It's like, no, those were the Soviets. Not really. I mean, basically, there weren't any sort of Tajiks or Lithuanians running Soviet policies. It was basically, I see a continuum of 19th century imperialism, even 18th, when you look at Ukraine, 19th century Russian imperialism, 20th century Soviet imperialism, but Russian imperialism. Today, you see Russia claiming as its own and as its provenance equally 19th century actions by the Russian Empire, as well as the same kinds of actions on the part of the Soviet Union. And to see, say, Russia deny Soviet crimes against humanity, such as mass deportations of be it Estonians or Crimean Tatars. If you have nothing to do with that regime and you're like, now we have a real Russia, new Russia, well, then you admit that those things happened. And, you don't try to cover it up, say, well,
And you used the dance of words. So in the end, it's not the size of a country or armies that open the doors, as you shared with us in this episode. It's words, then, the dance of words in diplomacy and in policy making, and those words chosen with clarity and courage. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for granting us the time and telling us a little bit of that journey that you had.
I'm not sure that, people get this. I find actually that, especially with this administration, you feel they can say anything they want. It's kind of the opposite of diplomacy. You can just say anything you want, and you understand that words have meaning. It's not just the ambiguous sort of euphemisms that I've spent the last 35 years dealing with, trying to get clarity. It's also sort of brutal language that, which is crude and doesn't really help. I'd say that, one thing is...
So not euphemism, but also clarity, but not...
rude.
Good, right?
Yeah. That's...
and having clarity with the diplomacy, not just chaos.
Right. Yeah, the problem with the chaos comes that there's no real concrete policy that's thought out. It's just kind of like knee-jerk actions and saying whatever you want at the time. It's hard to clean up afterwards.
Thank you for listening to The Diplomat. You can follow the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And if this episode helped you see diplomacy not as theater, but as survival, share it. Send it to someone who thinks small countries don't shape big moments, or someone who still believes language can outlast force. And let us remember that politics isn't just about what has been said, it's about what's carefully not said. And diplomacy, that's where the unsaid becomes strategy. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks. Until next time.